Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on medieval church history. We began last time with the reign of Pope Nicholas I, Pope 105, who reigned from 858 to 867. During his reign, we meet Saints Cyril and Methodius, and we left off there last time. So to assist us in this reflection, this is what Pope Benedict XVI had to say about them. Today, I would like to talk, this is from an audience he gave on June 17th, 2009. Today I would like to talk about Saints Cyril and Methodius, brothers by blood and in the faith, the so-called apostles of the Slavs. Cyril was born in Thessalonica to Leo, an imperial magistrate, in 826 or 27. He was the youngest of 7. As a child, he learned the Slavonic language. When he was 14 years old, he was sent to Constantinople to be educated and was a companion of the young emperor Michael III. In those years, Cyril was introduced to the various university disciplines, including dialectics, and his teacher was Phocius. After refusing a brilliant marriage, he decided to receive holy orders and became librarian to the Patriarchate. Shortly afterward, wishing to retire in solitude, he went into hiding at a monastery, but was soon discovered and entrusted with teaching the sacred and profane sciences. He carried out this office so well that he earned the nickname of philosopher. In the meantime, his brother Michael, born in about 815, left the world after an administrative career in Macedonia and withdrew to a monastic life on Mount Olympus in Bithynia, where he was given the name and religion of Methodius. A monk's monastic name had to begin with the same letter as his baptismal name, and he served in the monastery of Polychron. Attracted by his brother's example, Cyril too decided to give up teaching and go to Mount Olympus to meditate and pray. A few years later, about 861, the imperial government sent him on a mission to the Khazars on the Sea of Azov, who had asked for a scholar to be sent to them who could converse with both Jews and Saracens. Cyril, accompanied by his brother Methodius, stayed for a long time in Crimea, where he learned Hebrew and sought the body of Pope Clement I, who had been exiled there. Cyril found Pope Clement's tomb, and when he made the return journey with his brother, he took Clement's precious relics with him. Having arrived in Constantinople, the two brothers were sent to Moravia by the Emperor Michael III, who had received a specific request from Prince Radislav of Moravia. Quote, "Since our people rejected paganism," Radislav wrote to Michael, "they have embraced the Christian law, but we do not have a teacher who can explain the true faith to us in our own language." The mission was soon unusually successful. By translating the liturgy into the Slavonic language, the two brothers earned immense popularity. However, this gave rise to hostility among the Frankish clergy, who had arrived in Moravia before the brothers and considered the territory to be under their ecclesiastical jurisdiction. In order to justify themselves, in 867, the two brothers traveled to Rome. On the way, they stopped in Venice, where they had a heated discussion with the champions of the so-called trilingual heresy, who claimed that there were only 3 languages in which it was lawful to praise God: Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. The two brothers obviously, forcefully, opposed this claim. In Rome, Cyril and Methodius were received by Pope Hadrian II, who led a procession to meet them in order to give a dignified welcome to Clement's relics. The Pope had also realized the great importance of their exceptional mission. Since the middle of the first millennia, in fact, thousands of Slavs had settled in those territories located between the two parts of the Roman Empire, the East and the West, whose relations were fraught with tension. The Pope perceived that the Slav people would be able to serve as a bridge and thereby help to preserve the union between the Christians of both parts of the empire. Thus, he did not hesitate to approve the mission of the two brothers in Great Moravia, accepting and approving the use of the Slavonic language in the liturgy. The Slavonic books were laid on the altar of St. Mary, and St. Mary, Maria Maggiore, and the liturgy in the Slavonic tongue was celebrated in the basilicas of St. Peter, St. Andrew, and St. Paul. Unfortunately, Cyril fell seriously ill in Rome. Feeling that his death was at hand, he wanted to consecrate himself totally to God as a monk in one of the Greek monasteries in the city, probably Santa Prassede, and took the monastic name of Cyril. His baptismal name was Constantine. He then insistently begged his brother Methodius, who in the meantime had been ordained a bishop, not to abandon their mission in Moravia and return to the peoples there. He addressed this prayer to God: Lord my God, hear my prayers and keep the flock you have entrusted to me faithful. Free them from the heresy of the three languages. Gather them all in unity and make the people you have chosen agree in the true faith and confession. Cyril died on the 14th of February, 869. Faithful to the pledge he had made with his brother, Methodius returned to Moravia and Pannonia, today Hungary, the following year, 870, where once again he encountered the violent aversion of the Frankish missionaries who took him prisoner. He did not lose heart, and when he was released in 873, he worked hard to organize the church and train a group of disciples. It was to the merit of these disciples that it was possible to survive the crisis unleashed after the death of Methodius on the 6th of April, 885. Persecuted and imprisoned, some of them were sold as slaves and taken to Venice, where they were redeemed by a Constantinopolitan official who allowed them to return to the countries of the Slavonic Balkans. Welcomed in Bulgaria, they were able to continue the mission that Methodius had begun and to disseminate the gospel in the land of the Rus. God, with his mysterious providence, thus availed himself of their persecution to save the work of the Holy Brothers. Literary documentation of their work is extant. It suffices to think of texts such as the Evangeliarum, liturgical passages of the New Testament, the Psalter, various liturgical texts, in Slavonic, on which both the brothers had worked. Indeed, after Cyril's death, it is to Methodius and to his disciples that we owe the translation of the entire sacred scriptures and the books of the Fathers. Wishing now to sum up concisely the profile of the two brothers, we should first recall the enthusiasm with which Cyril approached the writings of St. Gregory of Nazianzus, learning from him the value of language in the transmission of the revelation. St. Gregory had expressed the wish that Christ would speak through him. I am the servant of the Word, so I put myself at the service of the Word. Desirous of imitating Gregory in this service, Cyril asked Christ to deign to speak in Slavonic through him. He introduced his work of translation with the solemn invocation, Listen, all of you Slav peoples, listen to the word that comes from God, the word that nourishes souls, the word that leads to the knowledge of God. In fact, a few years before, the Prince of Moravia had asked the Emperor Michael III to send missionaries to his country. It seems that Cyril and his brother Methodius, surrounded by a group of disciples, were already working on the project of collecting the Christian dogmas in books written in Slavonic. The need for new graphic characters closer to the language spoken was therefore clearly apparent. So it was that the Glagolithic alphabet came into being. Subsequently modified, it was later designated by the name Cyrillic, in honor of the man who inspired it. It was a crucial event for the development of the Slav civilization in general. Cyril and Methodius were convinced that the individual peoples could not claim to have received the revelation fully unless they had heard it in their own language and read it in the characters proper to their own alphabet. Methodius had the merit of ensuring that the work begun by his brother was not suddenly interrupted. While Cyril, the philosopher, was more inclined to contemplation, Methodius, on the other hand, had a leaning for the active life. Thanks to this, he was able to lay the foundations of the successive affirmation of what we might call the Cyrillian-Methodian idea. It accompanied the Slav peoples in the different periods of their history, encouraging their cultural, national, and religious development. This was already recognized by Pope Pius XI in his apostolic letter, Quod Sanctum Cyrillum, in which he described the two brothers, sons of the East, with a Byzantine homeland, of Greek origin, for the Roman missions, to reap Slav apostolic fruit. The historic role they played was later officially proclaimed by Pope John Paul II, who, in his apostolic letter, declared them co-patrons of Europe, together with St. Benedict, on the 31st of December, 1980. Cyril and Methodius are, in fact, a classic example of what today is meant by the term enculturation. Okay. Pope Nicholas I died on November 13th, 867. Followed as by Pope 106 by Pope Hadrian II, who was mentioned in that what I just read. He was a cardinal priest of San Marco at the time of his election. He accepted election on December 14th, 867, and reigned for 5 years. As a result of the restoration of good relations between Greeks and Latins at the Fourth Council of Constantinople, which will be discussed below, the Byzantine Emperor Basil I and the Holy Roman Emperor Louis II were able to cooperate with the blessing of the Pope Hadrian II in a military initiative against the menace of Muslim piracy, with the Greeks making an attack on the Saracen pirates operating out of bases on the Bosnian side of the Adriatic. That's the eastern side of the Adriatic. Louis made a simultaneous land attack on the Saracen Italian base of Bari. The result was the defeat and expulsion of the Saracen occupation and the destruction of the quarter century of the Emirate of Bari. The Saracens remained in control of parts of Sicily and the Mediterranean islands, but this military reverse put them on the defensive for many years to come. In recognition of this achievement, Pope Hadrian held a ceremony in St. Peter's in which he recrowned Louis II as Holy Roman Emperor on the 18th of May, 872. Which brings us to the the Fourth Council of Constantinople. We saw in the previous reign how the unjust and sinful deposition and imprisonment of St. Ignatius, the rightful Patriarch of Constantinople, resulted in a series of confrontations that ended with the false patriarch Photius and Pope Nicholas I excommunicating each other. In 867, the Byzantine Emperor Basil I released and restored St. Ignatius to his rightful position. They wrote together to Pope Nicholas, asking that a church council be held in order to restore union between East and West. Pope Nicholas died before the letter reached Rome, and as we saw, Pope Hadrian was distracted at the beginning of his reign, but he accepted the invitation. The result was the Eighth Church Council, recognized by the West, the Council of Constantinople IV. Constantinople IV met in the Church of Hagia Sophia for 10 sessions, opening on the 5th of October, 869, and closing on the 28th of February, 870. During this time, it produced 27 canons. The council opened with a routine profession of faith and a reaffirmation of the canons and teaching of the first 7 ecumenical councils. Toward the end, it summarized the events of the Phocian Schism, as it was called. The council explained that for Photius was lifted up to the heights of arrogance in attacking the most blessed Pope of Old Rome, Nicholas, and he vomited out the poisons of evil. The council deposed and anathematized Photius, his supporters, and any who refused to concur with his deposition. In Canon 11, the council condemned a heresy which Photius taught. In addition to everything else he did, the heresy was that human beings have 2 souls. One soul is capable of error, but the other soul is infallible. Infallible. You like that? It reaffirmed the propriety, the correctness of the veneration of images. It's Canons 3 and 7. To avoid the scandal of Photius having been raised from layman to patriarch in a week, Canon 5 mandated that no one could be made patriarch unless he had served at least a year as lector, 2 years as subdeacon, 3 years as a deacon, and 4 as a priest. The Greeks managed to get through a passage in Canon 21, which elevated Constantinople to the 2nd rank among the patriarchal sees. The papal legates did not like it because it did not honor the historical order, but since it neither denied papal primacy nor asserted jurisdiction over the other patriarchal sees, they were outvoted. At the time, the point was largely moot, as the 3, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, were in lands controlled by Islam. And, well, they still are. Not Jerusalem, but Alexandria and Antioch today still are. At the council, this council was later repudiated in the East in November of 879 by a later council, just for the sake of confusion, also called the Council of Constantinople, during which Photius regained his position as Patriarch of Constantinople after the death of St. Ignatius. So we're going to meet this guy. This guy's like fungus. He just doesn't go away. Pope Hadrian died in December of 872, December 14th, 872. He was followed as Pope 107 by Pope John VIII. At the time Pope Hadrian died, it was on December 12th, 872. One unintended consequence of the destruction of the Emirate of Bari the previous year was already evident, that the Saracens were not going away. So they had increased their raiding in southern Italy, looking for a new place to set up a base. As a result, 2 days after Hadrian died, the man elected to replace him was the Archdeacon of Rome, He was chosen because he had a military background before he went into the church. He accepted election as Pope 107 on the 14th of December, 872. He reigned under the title John the Eighth for 10 years. The election of a deacon represents a departure from the custom thus far in the early medieval period of electing men who had studied in the Lateran school. But of course, after being, he still had to be ordained a priest and a bishop, in order to be Bishop of Rome. The Archdeacon John was elected because he had military experience, which was believed to be essential at that moment. Therefore, he was ordained a priest and bishop, then crowned as pope later in December of 872. Those who feared that the Saracens would attack Rome in reprisal for the destruction of the Emirate of Bari were, of course, correct. Pope John VIII built 2 miles of new fortifications in Rome and followed that up by restoring the papal coast guard. He knew that in itself this would not be enough, but the situation did not become pressing until Louis II, the Holy Roman Emperor, the man who destroyed the Emirate of Bari, died in 875. With his removal from the scene, the enemies of the papacy smelled an opportunity. Remember that among these enemies were numbered not only the Saracens, but also the Lombards, who never had given up their dream of making all of Italy an independent kingdom, absorbing the papal state, with, of course, themselves in charge. The Duke of Spoleto at the time was Guido II. He was the first to approach the Saracens with a proposition that they cooperate, Lombards and Saracens, against their common enemy, the Pope, with the Lombards attacking by land and the Saracens by sea. On Christmas Day in the year 875, Pope John VIII had crowned Charles the Bald as Holy Roman Emperor. We met him before. He was a grandson of Charlemagne, and after the death of his father, Louis I, he inherited France, that part of the Carolingian Empire that's now France. He was the uncle of the recently deceased Louis II, the Saracen slayer. When Pope John VIII proposed that they join in a war of self-defense against the Lombard-Saracen coalition, Charles readily agreed. It's part of the Carolingian family heritage. Now that was noble of Charles, but with the constant threats posed by the Vikings on his homeland, France, he had a difficult time convincing many of his nobles that they should leave their land undefended in order to cross the Alps and engage 2 entirely different enemies on behalf of an Italian pope, when those 2 enemies, the Lombards and the Saracens, were not an immediate threat to France. For these reasons, Charles entered Italy with fewer troops than he would have wished, but as many as he could reasonably be expected to bring, given the Viking threat on his homeland. The Lombard-Saracen alliance was caught completely by surprise by the military readiness of the towns in the Papal State, and even more shocked to see organized forces opposing them. In 876, Pope John VIII personally led his coast guard in a surprise attack on Saracen ships and inflicted a severe defeat on them. Those captured were chained to their own ships, and those ships were set on fire and pushed out to sea as a warning to the retreating Saracens that the Papal State was not for the taking. Meanwhile, on land, Charles the Bald won a victory over the Lombards using French knights. But the small size of his force prevented this victory from being as decisive as it might otherwise have been. So it was a tactical victory, but not a strategic victory. As Eisenhower said in the 20th century, never send a battalion when you can send a division. During this campaign, John VIII learned the names of traitors within the ranks of the clergy and nobility of the Papal State, probably from captured Saracen captains. Because of the difficulty in communicating between land and sea, John VIII was not aware of the exact location of Charles's army, nor that he had won a victory over the Lombards. Fearful of leaving Rome undefended for too long, John VIII returned to Rome and immediately conducted a purge of the traitors. The laymen among the traitors were executed. The clergy among the traitors were deposed and banished. These included a guy named Formosus, Bishop of Porto. This guy will loom large in coming years. By the time John VIII received messages from Charles informing him of the good news of victory, but the bad news that the enemy was still combat effective, undeterred, John VIII began planning a large military operation, which would have included an amphibious attack on Saracen bases in southern Italy, just as the Saracens themselves had done so many times. But this combined with a land assault by Charles and the French knights. Planning for this was underway when Charles the Bald died, abruptly, after a brief illness, on the 6th of October, 877. Considering the situation at the time, it was natural that poisoning was suspected. I certainly believe he was poisoned. At that point, Charles's knights went to Rome to inform the Pope, first that that Charles was dead and that they were going back home. The Pope tried to persuade them to remain in Rome under his direction, but they replied that they had pledged their fealty to Charles in his capacity as King of France, not as Holy Roman Emperor, and they planned to return to France to serve his heir. Pope John played for time by telling them that he planned to crown that heir also as Holy Roman Emperor. This was another Louis, and in French history books he's called Louis the Stammerer. And John did crown this guy as Holy Roman Emperor on the 7th of September, 878. However, the Pope lost the knights anyway because Louis ordered them to return home to defend France against the Vikings. This Louis died, in any case, the following year, on the 10th of April, 879. With the greatest reluctance, John VIII had no alternative left but to allow the title of Holy Roman Emperor to pass from the French over to the German branch of the Carolingians, to the son of Louis the German, who became Charles III, Emperor Charles III, in 881. The immediate problem for Pope John manifested itself as soon as the French knights had returned home. He lacked the military resources to pursue a land campaign against the Lombard-Saracen alliance. Also, the traitors, whom he had either executed or banished from the city, all had relatives, and according to the ethos of the day, they had a blood vendetta, an obligation of vendetta, against the Pope for what he had done to their families. These relatives fulfilled their vendetta by opening a key defensive position to the Lombard-Saracen alliance, allowing them to pour into the city. Most in the city, of course, were not in on this, so the street fighting was fierce. The Pope, for the first time, was caught off guard, but led a tenacious resistance, which resulted in part of the city being controlled by papal forces and part by the Lombard-Saracen alliance. The Lombards offered peace to the city if the Pope would swear allegiance to them as their vassal. Naturally, he refused, but his situation was desperate. Knowing that he was the target, that he was the prize, he escaped with some men and made his way to southern France. He had been deeply impressed by the fighting quality and training of the French knights, and he wanted some of his own. His plan was to return with a force of them who would swear fealty to the Holy See, and use them to complete his planned campaign against the Lombard-Saracen alliance. At this point, another schism between Rome and Constantinople occurred. Pope John VIII learned that Ignatius, the much persecuted but ultimately vindicated Patriarch of Constantinople, died in 877 and was replaced by Photius, the same who had connived at the unlawful deposition of Photius, and who had been explicitly condemned by name and excommunicated by the Fourth Council of Constantinople. Shocked when he heard this, Pope John sent envoys to investigate. They learned the following. The Emperor Basil I, the Byzantine Emperor Basil I, doted on his son, named Constantine, and from his childhood included him in councils of state and even brought him on military campaigns. The scheming Photius perceived in this an opportunity to return to imperial favor and regain his power. He waited until St. Ignatius died in 877 before making his move. Photius then approached the imperial heir Constantine with what he claimed was historical evidence that the Emperor Basil's family, meaning his own family, was descended from the ancient Persian conqueror Cyrus the Great. Flattered, as was intended, Constantine brought the news to his father, the emperor, and as Photius had surmised, this returned him to the emperor's favor. Whoever said flattery gets you nowhere, that's not always true. This sufficed to get him named Patriarch of Constantinople to replace the late St. Ignatius. I mean, he just made this up. This is totally made this up. That this guy's family was descended from Cyrus. Then, in 879, Constantine, the prince, the Byzantine, the prince, died under circumstances that are unclear. His father, the Emperor Basil, went into a deep, deep depression from which he never truly recovered. Photius then conducted a seance in which the Emperor Basil saw, or believed he saw, his dead son, dressed in gold armor. Basil was so affected by whatever this experience was that he built a church on the site of what he believed was a vision. So either it was wishful thinking or it might have been the result of demonic action. I mean, who knows? If you conduct a seance, I mean, you're playing with spiritual fire. Still, after enabling him, or at least what he believed, was enabling him to see his dead son again, Photius then enjoyed complete dominance over the emotionally unstable emperor. He used this power to have another Council of Constantinople summoned in 879. This one is not recognized by the West. That false council overturned the true Fourth Council, which had excommunicated Photius. This triggered another schism, another Phocian schism, which ended only with the finality of death, which occurred after Pope John VIII himself was dead. But just to finish the story, Emperor Basil I was murdered in a hunting accident. He died. He died in a hunting accident, staged in 886 by his younger son Leo, who always resented the preference his father had given to the now deceased Constantine. Since Photius was closely associated with Basil, the new emperor Leo VI wanted him out, and being the consummate survivor that he was, Photius abdicated in 887 rather than risk being disposed of in another hunting accident. He retired to an obscure monastery in Armenia, where he died on the 6th of February, 893. It is not known if he repented of the many evils he committed. The final schism between East and West would not occur until 1054, but the antics of Photius contributed to the widening of the rift between them. Because of the false council of Constantinople in 879, which reversed the Fourth Council of Constantinople, the East has not recognized any ecumenical council after the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. For this, we have the pride and ambition of Photius to blame. A guy who conducted seances. Pope Hadrian had ordained, as we saw, Cyril and Methodius. He ordained them bishops in Rome in 869, but Cyril died there the same year, so Methodius returned to the missions. And this was the context for what I was mentioned and what I read from Benedict about the opposition from the Franks. The Archbishop of Salzburg was a guy named Theotmar from the Carolingian Empire. Pope Hadrian created him metropolitan, created a metropolitan see of Moravia, and appointed Methodius as its founding archbishop to resolve the jurisdictional dispute with Theotmar, as Theotmar was claiming that was under his metropolitan see, because he was in Salzburg. So that's how the Pope fixed this. All this, as this took place, oh no, I jumped. All right, yeah, I'll skip that. We covered that in what Benedict wrote, so I'll just skip down. Pope John VIII was caught off guard by the Italian vendetta that he brought on himself. On the 16th of December, 882, he was poisoned by a member of his own staff, who either shared in the vendetta or whose services had been purchased by those who did. Many popes before John VIII had been killed, but those were martyrs for the faith. Pope John VIII has the distinction of being the first pope killed in a political assassination on the 16th of December, 882, killed for reasons that had nothing to do with the faith. On the very same day, a well-regarded cleric of Rome was elected to take his place. He was of a noble family, but as a younger son was given to the church as a child. Raised in the Lateran school, after ordination entrusted with important diplomatic missions, most famously as one of the papal legates to the Council of Constantinople IV. His real name and his papal name were either Marinus or Marino. Because of its similarity to the name Martinus, in some of the old papal lists, he was erroneously called Pope Martin II, but in fact he was Pope Marinus I, Marinus. We saw in the previous reign that Pope John VIII had deposed and banished many high-ranking prelates from the papal state, as well as executed many laymen in July of 872. Among them was Formosus, Cardinal Bishop of Porto. John VIII undertook this action because he learned of factions among the Italian nobility working against the interests of the papal state, allied with the Lombard-Saracen alliance. And, at least he believed, all of these people were involved. These factions merely realigned themselves based on the political realities of the time. Their ultimate objective was the enrichment and aggrandizement of themselves, of course. The principal political reality with which everyone had to cope was the continuing disintegration of Charlemagne's empire. We saw that Charles the Bald had tried to fulfill the traditional Carolingian role of defending the papacy, but he was hampered by the overwhelming military necessity of defending France against relentless Viking raids. As a result, the Holy See was not secure at the time of Charles's untimely death and the assassination of Pope John VIII. As the stability of Europe continued to dissolve, and as the Carolingian dynasty failed to produce men of the caliber of Charles Martel, Pepin the Short, Charlemagne, the political realities of the day forced everyone, for survival, to choose sides between the French half or the German half of Charlemagne's empire. The factions among the Italian nobility were: one faction favored the French Carolingians, thinking, okay, they're just going through a rough patch, but they're going to come back. Second faction favored the German Carolingians. The third faction among the Italian nobility saw an opportunity presented to achieve the long-dormant dream of a regnum Italicum, of a kingdom of Italy that was independent as a sovereign kingdom. This faction was led by the Lombard, whom we've already met, Duke Guido of Spoleto. Some of the Roman aristocracy supported him in the hope that when Italy became independent, the ancient Roman Senate would be revived, and they would, of course, be senators. Pope John VIII had been of the first faction, the French group. Pro-French. He wasn't French, but he was of the pro-French group. Pope Marinus was of the second, of the pro-German group. Therefore, Marinus pardoned Formosus and the others John had exiled, and restored Formosus to his position as bishop of the Diocese of Porto. So from this, we can deduce that Formosus and his supporters had also been of the German-leaning faction. This is important, because this guy Formosus would one day become pope. Recall, the Lombards established their kingdom in Italy, the Regnum Langobardum, in 570. It had proven to be a bane to the papacy until it was crushed by Charlemagne and annexed to his empire in 776. Recall also that the Duchy of Spoleto had been part of that Lombard kingdom to the south and east of Rome. In 842, the Lombard dukes of Spoleto began scheming to expand their power, taking advantage of the chaos caused by the Saracen raids and Carolingian weakness. In 883, during the reign of Pope Marinus I, Duke Guido of Spoleto began calling himself King of Italy. Now, and there was nothing the Pope could do about it. Guido proved to be adept at exploiting the divisions among the Italian nobility so that the Pope could never get a strong, united faction behind him. And Pope Marinus died on the 15th of May, 884, after a reign of 1 year and 5 months. It is not known if he died of natural causes or was murdered. I mean, I kind of assume he was murdered, but there's nothing in the Liber Pontificalis doesn't say that. He was followed as Pope 109 by Pope Hadrian III, a priest of Rome from another aristocratic family, younger son, sent into the church, etc. He accepted election on the 17th of May, 884. Pope John VIII had been a supporter of the French Carolingians, so he had deposed and banished those prelates who supported the German. For that, they murdered John and secured the election of Marinus, who lifted the punishments and allowed them to return. Pope Hadrian III was of the other faction, the pro-French faction. Evidently, his family had a vendetta against some of the opposing faction, and once he came to power, he immediately exacted revenge. He had a layman among the nobility named George of the Aventine, had him arrested and blinded. And he had a woman of the nobility, her name was Mary. The last name wasn't recorded, but she was probably of the Aventani, of the same. Had her publicly stripped and whipped through the city of Rome, which resulted in her death. I mean, she died of her injuries or hemorrhaging. No reasons are survive in the record for these actions. But we can safely surmise that they were part of the vendetta cycle. Because, only revenge could make people that crazy. If you want to kill them, then there are easier ways to do it. But so it seems that, Hadrian was seeking revenge for the murder of Pope John VIII. While maintaining diplomatic relations with the French and attempting to do so with the Germans, Hadrian III concluded that neither was capable of asserting effective military aid in Italy. So Hadrian made a stunning, unbelievable change in papal policy by making diplomatic overtures to the Lombards. In fact, when Hadrian III left Rome to attend a meeting at Worms in Germany, he left as governor of Rome a Lombard. He was a bishop, but he was still a Lombard. That was John, the Bishop of Pavia, the old Lombard capital. In September of 885, Pope Hadrian III died suddenly at Modena before he managed to get out of Italy. His previous good health, coupled with his vendetta actions at the beginning of his reign, make assassination a plausible explanation. His body was not brought back to Rome. He was followed as Pope 110 by Stephen V, with the 6 in parentheses for reasons we previously explained. The German faction secured his election in September of 885. This meant that those who supported Hadrian III were driven from power in a purge of the Lateran palace. So you see the whole point. You see, those of you who have followed the previous courses, previous lectures, you remember how much time I spent on the saints in those previous lectures? And in this one, we only have Cyril and Methodius, and the rest is this, because this is it. So Satan hit back. In other words, that the church had achieved much good, much success in spreading the gospel with the Merovingian and the Carrolingian periods. And so, of course, they had to be attacked. Satanic attack was inevitable, attacking the church. And so this is what we get. So for now, and at this point in the 9th century, Satan was winning, using all that pride, envy, anger, sowing mistrust based on those lies, ambition, ethnic hatred, all the whole panoply of Satan's, his arsenal was being used. Okay. Back in France. Around the year 880, a Danish Viking chief named Siegfried managed to create a vast amphibious force by forging an alliance between Danish tribes, led by himself, allied with Norwegian Vikings, led by a guy named Rolf the Walker. It's spelled with, it's H-R-O-L-F, Rolf the Walker. Now, this guy is going to end up in French history, actually in a few ways. And in French history, he's called Rollo, R-O-L-L-O, Rolf the Walker, or Rollo. So an alliance between Siegfried the Dane and Rolf the Walker, who was from Norway. The aim of this alliance was to enable them all to penetrate deeper into what they perceived as the rich landscape of northern France. In November of 885, this force of 30,000 men, riding on 700 Viking longships, sailed up the Seine River to pillage the city of Paris. As we saw in our discussion of the origins of medieval knighthood, the church in France had elevated the necessity of perpetual self-defense into a religious duty, into a spiritual context. An indication of this state of mind can be seen in the decision of the French king, Charles III, to entrust the defense of Paris to two men, one a secular warlord, the other an ecclesiastical lord. The secular, the one who would lead the military part of it, was named Odo. He was the Count of Paris. Remember this guy, he's going to end up becoming King of France. The ecclesiastic was a guy named Jocelyn, who was the Bishop of Paris, obviously. When the Vikings came, Odo and Jocelyn were ready. Fortified bridges had been constructed across the Seine River to prevent the Vikings from sailing past Paris and then attacking from both sides. The Vikings were then, because of the fortified bridges, forced to dismount their ships, to beach their longships and attempt to take the bridges from opposite sides of the riverbank, fighting on foot. That attack commenced on November 25th, 885. These particular Vikings had never before raided into France, so they were not prepared for the style, the tactics with which the French knights fought. Disciplined, controlled, and tactically coordinated. For 2 months, the Vikings attacked these fortified bridges again and again. Each time they were beaten back. So they decided on a different approach. In January of 886, the Vikings withdrew their ships downriver and started trying to fill up the shallow parts of the river. In effect, trying to improvise a bridge. They're barbarians, so they didn't know how to build. They didn't have the engineering to build one, so they just thought, okay, if we dump enough stuff in the river, it'll act like a beaver dam, so, and then we could just, an improvised bridge. They used trees and rocks at first, and then they moved to using captured animals and captured people to throw the bodies into the river to try to build it up. At that point, the French knights committed a tactical, which is probably a tactical error, but understandable. They left their fortified position. Once they saw the Vikings rounding up, peasants from the countryside and just murdering them, and using them to pitch in the river to build it up. As remember, one of the vows of knighthood is to protect the weak and the innocent. So tactically, it was a mistake to leave their fortified position, but morally, it was the only thing that they could do. And they made an unexpected charge against the Vikings, which forced the Vikings temporarily to retreat. Really angry at this point, and at a loss as to how to deal with people who would just, would not run away screaming like villagers did, the Vikings decided to bring the bridges down with fire ships. They sacrificed 4 of their own longships, not needed because they had lost so many men in the battle against the knights that those ships weren't going to be used anyway. So the Vikings filled these ships with wood, which they set on fire, and then just pushed out into the current and let the current crash the fire ships into the bridges to bring them down. That was the plan. Bishop Jocelyn of Paris, who was a former monk, that's how he started his ecclesiastical life, remembered the stories of how the Vikings had destroyed the English abbey at Lindisfarne. He personally led a counterattack of French knights. They got into rowboats of their own, and they rowed their boats out to those fire ships, grappled themselves onto the fire ships, and then pulled, then got back on their boats and rowed and rowed the fire ships, diverting them so that they were beached on the banks of the river before they hit the bridges. And the Vikings went berserk, but so there's a stalemate for a time. The following month, February of 886, the French had a major setback when a torrential storm caused the river level to reach flood stage. And so it brought all that debris from these previous attempts, all the fighting, all the battle, it brought all that debris crashing into the bridges, at higher speed because it was at flood stage. And that resulted in the collapse of those bridges. The fortified towers on the far side of the river were then isolated, and the knights in those towers were cut off. And so the Vikings attacked them. maniacally. And they fought to the death, against a swarm of vindictive Vikings. But they all died before those in the city could row across to help them. The loss of the bridges meant that the Viking longships could sail upriver and pillage inland, just bypass Paris, which they did with great brutality against the cities of Le Mans and Chartres. This action divided the Viking invasion force, depriving it of the advantage of size which it had previously enjoyed. The French knights once again did the unexpected. Now this, it could be considered a tactical mistake, but this one was a sortie. So they left the fortified city, rowed across the river at night, and attacked those Vikings who had remained around Paris. Attacked their camp at night. The fighting was merciless. It was hand to hand. There's the knights, they couldn't put their horses on rowboats to go over, so they just rowed themselves over and they fought hand to hand. And it was merciless. I mean, it was a sortie. It took casualties on both sides. So many of the French died, many of the Vikings died. Some of the French survived and managed to row back. Meanwhile, Siegfried and the Danish Vikings then retreated, leaving Rolf the Walker and the Norwegian Vikings isolated in the interior of France. They departed France from the other direction rather than go back and try to back and deal with these knights. Instead, they just kept going east in France until they made it to Germany. They went to the Rhine River and then followed the Rhine up to the North Sea, and then from there they went into the Baltic rather than go through the Paris gauntlet again. So Rolf the Walker managed to survive, and remember this guy under the name Rollo. He's going to enter French history again in 25 years. On the 13th of January, 888, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles III, the great-grandson of Charlemagne, died. This represents the end of the Carolingian Empire in the sense that no direct descendant of Charlemagne through the Salic, the Salic way is patrilineal through the male line. So following that criteria, no direct descendant of Charlemagne ever ruled over his lands again. This Charles III died after fighting off a year-long siege of Paris by the Vikings from 885 to 86. He had no legitimate adult son, so the imperial title should have passed to his nephew, Arnulf, king of the German portion of what had been Charlemagne's empire. Arnulf, however, was not in effective control of Germany, being constantly occupied in putting down rebellious German warlords. And there was no other Carolingian heir upon whom the imperial title could be bestowed, which placed the Pope in an impossible situation. And at this point, it's still Pope Stephen V, Pope 110. Pope Stephen knew that the Holy See needed a military protector because the 9th century was not a safe place. The Saracens in Sicily were continuing to raid the mainland of Italy since the French departed, and with the Germans not able to help, the Pope turned to the Lombards. Guido III, Duke of Spoleto, who had been calling himself King of Italy, had the unexpected surprise of receiving what dozens of past Lombard chiefs had most coveted. Pope Stephen asked on his own to form an alliance, in return for which he offered to crown Guido as Rex, as King of Italy, and as Holy Roman Emperor. On this basis, the agreement was made and the deed was done on February 21st, 891. So a Lombard, after all of this, a Lombard becomes Holy Roman Emperor, and Rex Italicum, the King of Italy. Now, it was largely fictional because Italy was not, it was not politically coherent at this point. But they did get, at least for a while, a brief time, the Lombards fulfilled their long-standing dream. This action, though prompted by what the Pope believed to be inescapable military realities, would bring the papacy to its lowest point in history. So, the Renaissance papacy, all the corruption of that time is the better known. The Alexander VI, the Borgias, and all that. And that was morally repugnant, certainly. But that is trifling compared to the depths of depravity and debasement that occurred because of this alliance, because of this Lombard alliance. Now, I'm not blaming Steve. I mean, he was in a horrible situation. Necessity exists, and he was trying to do the best he could for the church. And this happened after his death. But this alliance facilitated what's going to happen now. Pope Stephen died on the 14th of September, 891, after a reign of 6 years. Followed as Pope 111 by none other than Formosus, whom we've had occasion to meet more than once. The pro-German faction in Rome remained strong enough upon Stephen's death to elect another pro-German on October 6, 891. He kept his baptismal name and reigned for 4 years and 6 months as the only pope with the name Formosus. Born in Ostia, the port of Rome, in 815, Formosus became Cardinal Bishop of Porto in 864, a strong proponent of the German Carolingian alliance. He was perceived as an enemy by the pro-French Pope John VIII, who, as we saw, deposed and banished him and dozens of others. Since there was no trial, there is no record of any evidence for this belief about Formosus, so we don't know. It could have just been rumors. It could have been just because who he was related to or who he was friends with, or he might have actually been guilty. He might have been one of the ones that was seeking an alliance with the Saracens and Lombards. We just don't know. And as we saw, John VIII was assassinated for this, followed by Marinus. So by this point, Formosus was already 76 years old. But the pro-German faction needed a reliable pope after the death of Stephen V, and Formosus had never deviated in his support for the German Carolingians. The succession of the Carolingian King of France to Charles III was contested by Odo, the Count of Paris, the one we saw who defended Paris in the siege. His family, it was considered the House of Robert, the Robertian house, named for his father, Robert the Strong, Robert the Strong. Eventually, Odo of Paris is the source genealogically of the Capetian, the Capetian dynasty, which is going to reign over France for a significant part of the Middle Ages. Anyway, I say that just so you remember these people. The result of this struggle, this power struggle in France, would continue for a century, with ascendancy tilting from one to another, the pro-Carolingians or the Robertians, the future Capetians, until the Robertians finally triumphed and took over France in 987 as the Capetian dynasty under the leadership of Hugh Capet, whom we'll meet in due course. So just know, I mention that now because this takes France out of the loop. It's a civil war. It's a 100-year civil war. They decide who's going to be running things. At the same time, they periodically have to stop killing each other to kill Vikings. Otherwise, the Vikings will kill them. So France is out of the loop. So back to the Holy See. Formosus, as Pope, inherited a major problem bequeathed to him by the desperation of his predecessor, Stephen, who crowned the Lombard Duke of Spoleto as Holy Roman Emperor, Emperor Guido. The result was the Lombards, of course, they moved troops into Rome and imposed a military dictatorship on the Holy See. Formosus was crowned at Spear Point, was forced at Spear Point to crown Guido's son, Lambert, as co-emperor in April of 892. Guido, following Charlemagne's example, thought by having his son crowned, it would guarantee the succession and then keep the Spoletan, dynasty, Lombard dynasty, intact. Formosus, he agreed because under duress, but afterward, Formosus wrote a secret letter to Arnulf in Germany, who was a Carolingian but not of Charlemagne's direct line, begging him to deliver the Holy See from bondage to the Lombards. By this point, Arnulf had put down his opponents in Germany, so he obliged the Pope. He had enough Carolingian blood to do that. He crossed the Alps and liberated Rome by force from the Lombards in February of 896. Formosus then crowned Arnulf as Holy Roman Emperor in the same month. The next step in the plan was for Arnulf to invade the Lombard Duchy of Spoleto, to go hit Guido on his home turf and just kill him, eliminate him. This plan was diverted by a botched assassination attempt against Arnulf. It was poison. It left him paralyzed, but was not sufficient to kill him. So Lambert, the son and eventually the successor of Guido of Spoleto, never forgot and never forgave either Formosus or the people of Rome for this betrayal. So keep this in mind, as it is the only explanation for the macabre vengeance that the Spoletans will eventually take on Formosus. Formosus died on the 4th of April, 896, after a reign of 4 years and 6 months. He was followed as Pope 112 by Boniface VI, who died 15 days after election. Cause of death unknown. He was followed as Pope 113 by Stephen VI, with 7 in parentheses because of the Stephen problem. At that point, something went terribly wrong in the weeks following the death of Formosus. The full explanation has not been preserved in the existing sources. So we have a few facts. We know what happened subsequently. And so, retroactive inference and deduction is necessary. So what I'm giving you is a plausible reconstruction. The following facts are known concerning the reign of the 113th Pope, Stephen VI. Fact number 1. There was a longer delay than usual in choosing a successor that had been the case in previous. There was a delay of over 1 month, whereas the pattern had been within days, sometimes on the same day as the Pope was buried, there'd be an election. So none of the previous guys has been more than 3 to 5 days. So a delay of a month. Fact number 2. Lambert, the reigning Duke of Spoleto, and crowned co-emperor with his father Guido, was still claiming to be the sole emperor since his father died in 894. He was still burning to avenge what he viewed as the betrayal of his family by Pope Formosus. Fact number 3. The man chosen as Pope 113, Pope Stephen, had been Bishop of Anagni. He was also a bitter enemy of Pope Formosus and his pro-German Carolingian faction, because Stephen was of the same family as Agiltrude. The Lady Agiltrude was the wife of Duke Guido of Spoleto and the mother of the reigning Lambert, Duke of Spoleto. She had been captured by the German troops of Arnulf, the German Carolingian, who had come to help the Pope, and subjected to treatment that, the best left unsaid. This is a family-friendly channel. But, she managed to survive, and her family, Lambert had to buy her free, had to ransom her to get her back, but he did. And that fueled the obligation of vendetta felt by her son and her kinsman, Pope Stephen VI, against Formosus, because it was Formosus who had summoned the Germans to come in, and the Germans did this to Lambert's mother, who's also Stephen's relative. So, with this background, we can better understand the otherwise inexplicable cadaver synod of January 897. Yes, cadaver, as in corpse, as in dead body. The cadaver synod of 897. Pope Stephen VI ordered that the corpse of Pope Formosus be dug up, removed from its grave, and dressed in full pontifical robes. The corpse was then placed on trial to answer the charges of which Formosus had been accused all the way back in the reign of Pope John VIII. And he had never had a trial, but nevertheless he had been deposed and banished in 872. So now Stephen puts his corpse on trial on those charges. His corpse was, at the end of the trial, his corpse was found guilty of treason and of perjury for having lied to restore himself to the good graces of the church and get elected as pope. So his corpse was sentenced to mutilation. The 3 fingers of the right hand were cut off, because that's the blessing, the way they did blessings then, it was cut off, so the corpse could no longer do papal blessings. The corpse was then executed by drowning in the Tiber River. Fearing that this grotesque spectacle was the beginning of a purge of all those in Formosus pro-German faction, Pope Stephen VI was assassinated. Somebody decided to get ahead of the wheel of death and assassinated him in August of 897, after a reign of 1 year and 3 months. Only 7 months after the cadaver synod condemned the corpse of Formosus to execution. Following Stephen, as Pope 114, was Pope Romanus. No numeral, because so far no other pope has taken that name. Just as Stephen VI and Lambert Spoleto felt driven by vendetta to avenge the treatment received by Agiltrude, Lambert's mother, so also now the family of Pope Formosus and his supporters had a vendetta to avenge the cadaver synod, to avenge what was done to Formosus at the cadaver synod. At the same time, the family of Stephen and Lambert now had an additional vendetta, so Lambert had to avenge Stephen's assassination, because Stephen and he were kinsmen. The Formosan faction elected a priest named Romanus. At the time he was serving at San Pietro in Vinculi. As it turned out, Pope Romanus was a man of peace, who tried to mediate a truce between the factions, arguing that the murder of Stephen and the disgrace of the corpse of Formosus should nullify the mutual vendetta. This was not acceptable, so Romanus was deposed in November of 897, after a reign of 4 months. Of course, the deposition is not canonical, so not recognized. He was sent into a monastery where where he died, presumably of natural causes, but, who knows. Followed as Pope 115. So it was a moot point, in other words. Even though the deposition is not valid, he died anyway, shortly after, or was killed. So the next Pope, 115, Theodore II. After the deposition and banishment and death of Romanus, the Formosan faction, the pro-Germans, elected another Roman priest as Pope 115, and this is Pope Theodore II. The corpse of Pope Formosus had been rescued from the Tiber River after it drowned, and secretly was buried by unnamed persons in Rome. Pope Theodore II, who was of the same faction as Formosus, ordered that his corpse be dug up again, once more dressed in pontifical robes, this time for a proper pontifical rite of committal, in a crypt in St. Peter's Basilica. Pope Theodore II then died 20 days after his election. After the death of Theodore II, a power struggle emerged between the House of Spoleto, ethnically Lombard, politically committed to an independent Italy ruled by themselves. Second, the Tusculani. The Tusculani, these are the counts of Tuscany who were ethnically mixed. Italians with Greeks. Some Italians in Tuscany had married into the Greek Theophylact family, who were connected to the old Exarchate of Ravenna when it was still Byzantine. And these are the descendants of them who had just stayed in Italy. Politically, the Tusculani were shifty. At times, they favored the fantasy of restoring allegiance to the Byzantine Greeks, thinking that they themselves would become the exarchs. But at times, they supported whoever else was ascendant. After a period of street fighting, the House of Spoleto, the Lombards, used Lombard troops to install a Benedictine monk as Pope John IX. Absolutely nothing is known about this guy's previous life. He summoned a synod to meet in Rome, and then went north to Ravenna and convened a second synod. Both had the same objectives. First, to declare an amnesty for all sides in hopes of stopping the vendetta cycle. Second, to recognize Lambert of Spoleto as the legitimate emperor. Remember, he had been crowned by Formosus under duress, but, still had been crowned. And it wasn't Lambert who was forcing it. It was Guido. It was Lambert's father. Third, to confirm that Lambert, in exchange for being recognized legitimately as Holy Roman Emperor, would then fulfill the role of protecting the independence of the Holy See, which is the whole purpose of creating the Holy Roman Empire. This moderation, the unacceptability of this kind of moderation in a land ruled by the Code of Vendetta, was soon made apparent when the Emperor Lambert was assassinated. He died in a hunting accident. All right, he died in a hunting accident. And then Pope John John IX, died suddenly under mysterious circumstances in January of 900, obviously assassinated. Considering subsequent events, retroactively, it is reasonable to infer that the culprits were the Tusculani, or that they paid for someone to do the deed. This ends the 9th century. So it brings us, this happened in January of 900. So next we'll move into the 10th century, which is not all that much better, but we will, at least we will have some more religious stuff to talk about, as we'll have Cluny, the Abbey of Cluny, and the monastic renewal, and we will meet some more saints in that century than we did in this misbegotten 9th century. So anyway, that's where we'll pick up next time. For now, this session is concluded. This session is adjourned. Thank you for your attention.